Many of us overdo it on many things around this time of year, and I am certainly no exception to this rule. We all have our Christmas vices, whether it's drink, general food, or for those with more of a sweet tooth, chocolate and sweets. These days, the shelves are dominated by the same names: Cadbury, Nestle, Rowntree, and occasionally the odd Fry's chocolate bar. But there was a time when the city of Norwich had not only its own chocolate factory, but a world-famous chocolate brand. The story of Caley's didn't begin with chocolate, but rather mineral water. Albert Jana Caley and his business partner Octavius Corder had originally relocated a small chemist shop they had been running in Windsor for several years to number 31 London Street, Norwich in 1857. In 1862, after a few years in business, they began to manufacture bottled mineral water and other soft drinks in their cellar. These took off and became so massively popular around the city, they were forced to open a second shop in Bedford Street, just a 1 minute walk from their original shop that specialised in selling their beverages. By 1880, with popularity still growing, it soon became clear that a cellar of a small chemist shop would never be enough to keep up with demand, and Albert, now assisted by his son Edward, his partnership with Octavius Corder had dissolved in 1874, set up a bottling factory in an area of the city known as Chapelfield East. They took over a former glove cloth factory owned by a George Allen that had been standing empty, and sank two wells, 400 and 500 foot deep, to provide them with the water they needed. And by 1881, their drinks were now by far the largest branch of their trade. They began to branch out even more away from mineral water into different types of soft drinks, from lemonade to soda water to ginger beer, which was their speciality, and even iron water. In the upcoming years, their beverages will be enjoyed by members of the royal family and in Parliament. The change from soft drinks to chocolate began for a very simple reason: to maintain jobs. Bottled water and soft drinks were not an all year round product as they are today. They were seasonal, being sold in the spring and the summer, not wanting to have the factory sitting empty for months of the year and employees out of work. As Albert is described as a very considerate employer and implored by his deeply Christian nature, he took a keen interest in the welfare and lives of his employees and did not like having to lay them off every year. So, in 1883, they brought a new product into their line. In the spring and summer, they would make their regular soft drinks, but in the autumn and winter, they would switch to drinking chocolate, or hot chocolate, or cocoa, depending on what you prefer to call it. Once again, it proved a huge hit. Seeing that their beverages were flying off the shelves, and their name was now becoming rather synonymous with quality, and taking a look at the massive success other companies such as Cadbury's were having with their eating chocolate, they decided to begin producing their own in 1886. At the time, the now long-gone Victoria Railway Station was located just a few hundred yards from the factory, on what is now the site of Marsh and a Sainsbury's car park. This soon became the main hub of their exportation, sending goods all over the country. Expansion was undertaken once again in the 1890s, when a second factory was built, this one purely for their eating chocolate, and the whole complex was renamed the Fleur de Lis Works. With Caley's chocolate brand now fully established, Albert retired in 1894, handing the business fully over to his son and his two nephews, Stuart and Fred. Albert would pass away the following year with an estate valued at £22,000. That's £2,878,316.54 today. 3 years later, the company officially became A.J. Caley and Sons. The same year, they began to branch out away from food and drink. Once again, in order to increase the amount of jobs available to the factory's workers, they began the production of mini Christmas crackers they would become famous for, all of which were largely handmade by the factory's female employees, who normally worked on the inside of the chocolate boxes. Much of the art designed for these products were the creations of famed artist Alfred Munnings. Born in Suffolk, he would go on to make his name as a war artist during the First World War. In 1901, they switched to making their chocolate Swiss style. At the time, the milk chocolate being produced in Switzerland was considered by many to be the best chocolate in the world. It was imported into Britain by the ton, which had led to Cadbury's making chocolate the same way to try and claim some of this business. They had been the first company in Britain to make chocolate this way. Caley's had decided to go into direct competition with them. Using milk provided by Mr. Garrett Taylor and his herd of red poll cattle from the nearby hamlet of Whitlingham, they soon became well renowned for their product. The workforce numbered around 700 by 1904 and increased to 1,200 by 1912. Their chocolate, drinks and crackers were being shipped all over the world, as far away as India and Australia, with their Christmas crackers proving a hit over the Channel in Paris. Caley's chocolate was one of the bars included in the soldiers' rations during the First World War, known as Caley's Marching Chocolate, or Marcho. 1918 brought an end to the First World War, as well as the first sale of the Caley's company, when Edward sold it to the Eastern and African Trading Company controlled by the Lever brothers. The sale would have little effect on the Norwich factory, other than increasing their global reach, and now allowed direct access to large quantities of raw cocoa that the E&A Trading Company needed an outlet for. They would carry on making chocolate under their original name. During the 1920s, the company was valued at around £1 million. That's just short of £50 million today. 4 new factories were built in the Chapelfield site in 1920 at a cost of £500,000. The work done tripled the capacity of the location, allowing them to branch out once again, this time making Christmas puddings. Sadly, the good times were not to last for long. Like it did for many, the Great Depression hit the confectionery world hard. There was little call for chocolate, sweets, mineral water, or Christmas crackers, and people had to sell their dinner plates for money or send their children out to beg for bread. Caley's was no exception, and soon found themselves on the verge of closing. In 1932, when the factory was sold again, this time to John Mackintosh and Sons from Halifax, Yorkshire, it was just for £138,000. They bought as they wished to increase their own production capacity and couldn't resist such a bargain. Their intervention undoubtedly saved Caley's, and as time got better, we once again expanded the factory's capacity. But difficult calls had to be made. Several of the company's old departments and product lines were discontinued to make way for Mackintosh's products. It was under this new management that Rolos were produced for the first time in 1937, with Norwich being the main location where they were produced. As the sweets grew in popularity, the Norwich factory was making 2 tons an hour, and they were being enjoyed as far away as Canada and Fiji. The first 7 years of their ownership, Mackintoshes had allowed the Caley's brand to operate fairly independently, but those days were coming to an end. 1939 marked the beginning of the end of their legacy, as their new owners from Yorkshire made moves to bring them fully under their brand. But as storm clouds gathered over the use of the name, very different storm clouds gathering over Europe would save the Caley's name for the time being, but would lead to the downfall of the factory. Norwich was bombed several times during the war, something we will cover in a future video. The most famous attack came as part of the Baedeker Blitz, a series of retaliation raids by the Luftwaffe for the increasing number of RAF bombings on German cities. The raids take their name from the Baedeker guidebooks that were used to plan the raids, as they contained detailed maps of various cities across Britain. These raids were also carried out to break civilian morale rather than destroy military targets. Between April and May of 1942, the bombs fell in Exeter, Canterbury, Bath, York, and of course Norwich. In total, 1,637 people were killed, and a further 1,760 injured, with up to 50,000 homes destroyed across the country. It was 21 minutes past 11 on the night of the 27th of April 1942, when the air raid sirens sounded across the city of Norwich. The first raid lasted about 90 minutes, with 160 high explosive bombs dropped on the city. Caley's factory was initially missed, but the printing works next door were hit and caught fire. A team of 30 fire guards hired by the Mackintosh company, jokingly referred to as the Chocolate Fire Guards, battled desperately to try and stop the fires from spreading, even resorting to pumping water from the factory's old wells from 1880 after a bomb fractured the city's water mains. Despite their best efforts, between the high winds and the factory taking a hit from an incendiary bomb during the second wave, it would soon be completely destroyed. Citizens of the city woke up to burnt chocolate wrappers blowing in the morning breeze the next day, and parts of the factory were still burning under the rubble up to a week later. Reconstruction work would not begin on the factory until 1946, with some production restarting shortly after, but the factory would not be completely rebuilt until 1952. With their brand new factory up and running, the workers at Caley soon found themselves producing many of the brand new chocolates that came out in the early 50s. From Munchies to Caramac, they had come a long way from the humble chocolate bar. The rebirth of the factory would also see the end of their line of mineral water, being produced since the very beginning, was sold off to a local brewery who carried on production, but would sadly soon completely die off with the decline of local breweries in the mid-20th century. They would also merge their mini Christmas cracker line in 1953 with Tom Smith & Co., the makers of the original Christmas cracker, who would take over manufacture for them. But they would carry on under the Caley's name, as mini Christmas crackers had become synonymous with them. The early 1960s finally brought an end to the Caley's name, with it being completely phased out when Mackintosh's merged with Rowntree, and the Chapelwood site now became purely a Mackintosh's factory. During the 1970s and 80s, Mackintosh's would be awarded the Queen's Award for Export several times, and had a workforce of around 1,000 now working in Norwich. Along with their year-round confectionery, they were also now producing 40 million Easter eggs every year, and at its height, the Chapelwood factory covered 7 acres. When the end came for the factory, it was quick. Another corporate takeover, this time of Rowntree's by Nestlé, in 1988 was their death knell. Just 8 short years after the purchase, Nestlé wanted to move all production to the city of York. Despite the protests of workers and locals and a huge Save Our Factory campaign, there was no going back. The factory closed in 1996 with a loss of 900 jobs. The end of the factory, however, didn't mean the end of the brand. In 1997, a group of former employees would buy the rights of Caley back from Nestlé, as well as many of the factory's machines, and would try to carry on business. They formed Caley's of Norwich Limited. Caley's had effectively risen from the ashes, They would begin to start producing chocolate again, but of course on a far smaller scale than they had before. Caley's return to Norwich would not be a long one. In 1999, the newly resurrected Caleys moved their business to Hampshire, where it still resides today. Among its products is a rebranded version of the famed marching chocolate. It is sold to benefit the charity Help for Heroes, a charity that gives aid to men and women and their families who are leaving the armed forces due to injury. The factory buildings themselves would stand empty until being totally demolished in 2004 to make way for the Chapelfield Shopping Centre. During the demolition, a sliver of Norwich's dark past was discovered. A well, far older than those dug in 1800, was uncovered. In the well itself was up to 17 bodies, all believed to be from Norwich's small Jewish community, who had either been murdered or disposed of down the well during the Middle Ages. After an archaeological investigation, the bodies were taken and given a decent burial. We will cover this story in full on another date. The Chapelfield Shopping Centre opened the following year in 2005 and still operates from the former chocolate factory site to this day. I hope you enjoyed this presentation. All the information and pictures used can be found in the description below. Feel free to subscribe and like if you wish. This was Caley's, Norwich's chocolate making past, and this was a little bit of history.